Hello, everyone. My name is Linda Grove, and I'm going to be talking with you for the next few minutes about literature reviews and how you can use them most effectively when you want to publish. Let me begin by sharing my screen. So you should have, please also have at hand the handout on literature surveys, which includes some sample text that we will be talking about. So I want to start with what a literature review is. I think most of you probably already know this, and how you might most effectively present it in a journal article. Let me begin by saying that in a sense, academic discourse is like a continuing conversation. Somebody says something or publishes something or does research on a subject, and then someone else responds with new ideas, agreeing or disagreeing, adding on examples that maybe complicate the situation. When we publish an article or a book, we are in fact joining an ongoing conversation. And when you join a conversation, any kind of a conversation, you need to listen to see what other people have said so far and what you can add to that, something that is new ideas, new data, new approaches, an argument against the one people have made before. During the research project, we always search to find out what has already been published about the subject. That's usually how you start a research project, since you don't want to spend a whole bunch of time doing research and then discover somebody has already published exactly the same ideas or the same material. So we do the research at the beginning of the research project. We will look for what has already been published about the subject. And then when we come to publish, we want to figure out how to present our ideas and the contribution we're making. And in an article, which is relatively short, we want to figure out the most efficient way to do that. I just want to remind you of a few things about the literature reviews and the research project. I think most research projects begin with a literature review. You search to find out what has been published and related to your project. Most likely, you will do that in several languages. And as you're doing that, you get some sense of what that ongoing conversation has been about so far. So you will get a recognition for what you think is missing. You have some new idea or some new approach you want to act. So this is what we refer to as a research gap. And it will help you to define your research question. How have people talked about this so far? Is there something missing? What can I put in? And it's also going to, of course, provide the sources for your reference. Now, all of us, I think, in writing, I think all of you have probably written an MA, and some of you have finished your PhD dissertation. Some of you may be working on them. And you have to, of course, include a literature survey as part of your dissertation. But you have to remember that that dissertation is written basically only for your committee. You need to show them you are qualified to earn the degree. So it is customary practice to include a substantial survey of previous research as part of the thesis or dissertation. It often is a whole chapter. It may be 15 pages or so, maybe even longer. The members of your committee are probably the only people who will ever seriously read through the whole literature survey in your dissertation. The literature review in a journal article should be much shorter, and it is there to help you introduce your contributions to the ongoing conversation. You no longer need, if the article has been accepted for publication, you're not in a position where you have to show that you're qualified to do something. We already know you're qualified to do something. The one exception to this is that you may at some time be asked to write a survey of the field or a survey on a big question that is crucial to your field. The rules are different for that than they are for the normal literature survey in a journal article. So if we look at literature review and journal articles, some of the ways you might go about doing a kind of literature, working your literature survey in, are first to use it to define a research gap. So previous scholarship has approached the problem in X way, but not considered Y. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to now do Y. I'm going to approach it from this new way. A second way to do it might be, it depends on what your research is, to describe methodological approaches. If you're using a new methodology for a problem that has been previously studied in some other way, then you can start with that kind of approach. You can use it to outline conceptual terms. This particular term was developed by a certain scholar and has been used in a certain way. And whether you're going to use it in the same way or different way, it's crucial to what I'm going to say. You can use the literature review as a part of the introduction to describe conclusions from earlier studies that you disagree with. Or you can say, up until now, people have basically looked at this only within a certain framework. I'm going to now broaden that framework by adding comparative work, which will give us a new kind of approach. Or I'm going to give you a new example or incident that will broaden our understanding of the general project, general ideas. So what I want to do now, I've given you samples from 4 short articles, and I thought I would you have only the brief introductions to the articles, which incorporate the literature survey. I happen to be a historian who works on modern and contemporary Chinese social and economic history, and as you can see from the kind of examples I've chosen, they all come from Chinese studies. One could do this same exercise with materials from a wide variety of subjects. The 4 articles that I've chosen, in fact, come from people from 4 different disciplines. The first one comes from an article that I published a couple of years ago in 2018, and on prostitution in a small North China town in the 1930s. It has probably the simplest version of a kind of use of a literature survey. If you look past the abstract at the very beginning, it says basically in this first sentence, almost all the studies of prostitution in Republican era China in English, Chinese, and Japanese have focused on prostitution in big cities. And now I have data, and I'm going to talk about small towns, what was going on in small towns. The references to all of the earlier literature are then, in fact, in the first footnote. You don't have to look at them in any detail, but it basically cites the best known works about prostitution in big cities in China in the 1920s and 1930s. And then the next paragraph says, okay, how are we doing this? The materials that are the basis for this come from unedited field notes that have only recently been discovered. So we've got a very simple research gap. People have only looked at big town prostitution or prostitution in big cities. Now we have a chance to see what is going on in small towns. In fact, later on in the article in various parts, material from those studies of big city prostitution are worked into various other parts of it. So there are little bits of literature survey worked in later on, and to talk about how small towns are different from big cities. But it's basically a very straightforward, here's in the first sentence, basically, you can see the research gap and what's happening. The other articles are a bit more complicated. The next one is called Chinese Agrarian Change in World Historical Context. It's by an economist. And in the opening paragraph, he poses the question that he's interested in, which happens to be the question of rural collectivization or commune, socialist style agriculture. And he says at the beginning of the People's Republic of China in 1949, 1950s, China went from private family agriculture through land reform and through collectivization into the socialist mode where everybody was involved in communes. And then when the reforms come along in the early 1980s, they get rid of that. So you have a cycle from basically kind of private family-based agriculture through group socialist agriculture and back. And he says, okay, how do we make sense of this? So at the top of the second page of the document he says the obvious question is, how are we going to make sense of what seems to be a full circle? And then he says, up until now, people have there have been many, many studies of this sort of question, and scholars fall into kind of three groups with their explanations. And he runs through those explanations, one of which attributes it to the personality of the leader, one of which attributes it to struggles between the peasantry and the Chinese Communist Party, and one of which groups which attributes it to the kind of economic inefficiency or irrationality of the collective system. If you look at this, one of the interesting things is that he does not, in any of the three groups, sort of put it around a particular person. I mean, I think when we first start writing literature surveys, it's very tempting to say, well, XX said this and YY said this and ZZ said this, and it goes on and on. It's much more effective to do it the way he has done it here, where he's given us three big trends in explanation. The citations are all done social science style, so you just have the name of the author and the date. And if you want to know who they are, you can go and find them in the bibliography at the end. So he's not recounting who said what, but is recounting the trends of the conversation. And then he comes up and says, okay, and here's what I'm going to do. If you look at the top of page 183, the first full paragraph, he says, overall, most existing studies look at the Chinese story in isolation and have a kind of Chinese exceptionalism view. And I'm going to argue that it's an integral part of a global history story, that it's not just in China that these kinds of things happened. And he's going to explain it then in a global historical context. So he's told you what the research gap is, but the research gap is one that comes out of what has been a long history of explanation of the problem, and he's going to give us a new perspective. So that's the second one. We need to go to the third one is from a political scientist, a young political scientist most of whose work is the first book he's published is in fact on contemporary, basically since 1949 Chinese politics. And the article that I've given you here was published in the Journal of Asian Studies. So he's gotten it into a major English language journal, international journal, and he's looking at something he calls the political geography of empire, Chinese varieties of local government. It's interesting because he's basically going to go back and look at pre-revolutionary practice, i.e. quite pre-revolutionary 18th and 19th century practice, to see what it can tell us about an issue that is often discussed by contemporary political scientists. So he, in the introductory article, introductory paragraph, he first tells us what he's going to look at, or the sources he's going to use, which are really looking at kind of administrative strategies under the Qing dynasty. And he's looking particularly at 18th and 19th century. And then he's going to use that to look at the state, to see what we can learn for the state building literature. At the top of the second page, the first full paragraph, he tells us where the research gap is. This practice of differentiating governance raises important issues in political science, as well as Qing history. Until recently, the state building literature in political science has given scant attention to subnational variation in state strength. So he's going to look at subnational units. And then he goes on to very briefly talk about previous work on this. And he then says that he's going to present a corrective analysis of how state builders skillfully managed limited power resources to cope with locally uneven political challenges. And then he goes on to explain what his sources are. So in his case, the literature survey is presented in like 3 or 4 sentences in something very, very short. But it effectively tells us what is different and what he thinks he's going to contribute to the ongoing research. And it obviously was persuasive to the people who published the Journal of Asian Studies, and they decided to take it on. The last of these articles is kind of interesting. It was written by a young anthropologist who in fact participated in one of our writing workshops. And it was she then, on the basis of the advice she got at the writing workshop, reworked this paper. Like many anthropological papers, one of the most important things about what she wants to do is to tell how her field work has something to do with the question she's trying to do. And so she begins, in fact, with a quite long, the first 2 pages of the handout you have, discussion of an episode. Basically, it's got to do with workers thinking their factories are haunted. Now, this may sound like a very strange thing to you, but there is in fact a relatively long tradition in Chinese sociological anthropological studies of industry, both in China and in Southeast Asia, of the problem of workers beginning to think they're seeing ghosts in the factory. And then there have been all kinds of explanations about this. And she goes through, in fact, explains how these have been dealt with. If you look at the top, for example, of page 123, she says ghosts, spirits, possessions, supernatural dreams, the devil, demons, and so on derive from a worldview that was prevalent before modern capitalism. And when they disrupt a factory, it has generally been interpreted in the scholarly literature as gestures of protest, resistance, or warnings against capitalist relations by the powerful. So if you're familiar, for example, with James Scott's work of Weapons of the Weak, people have picked up on those ideas and talked about how these kind of ghosts are something like that. She then goes through and talks about how you see these, how other people have seen these ghosts. In this case, she does associate specific authors, some of whom are quite well known, with their interpretations in a very short way. Nobody gets more than about a sentence or so, but she gives us enough of the history of the ongoing discussions of ghosts in factories to know where the conversation has gone so far. And anyone who is an anthropologist working in this field would have been familiar with it. And after going through this, she then says, okay, so what am I going to do? And this is on page 124. She says, I instead propose to examine this factory's labor relations through a cultural lens. And I will demonstrate that haunting is not so much an act of resistance as a warning from and means to mend the moral world. And so she's going to give us a different approach. And when the article then goes on, she first goes back and talks about the ways ghosts have been seen in Chinese society and history, and then works out her analysis of what is being said. So these are 4 different ways of looking at what you do with a literature survey in an article. I've put down a few rules, simple rules to remember. The first is to keep it short and concise. I mean, you don't want to spend so much time talking about other people's work that you don't have time to talk about your own. So the first, you want to keep it short and concise for that reason. But also, I mean, your readers are going to be interested in what you say about somebody else, but they're really the most important thing they want is to get what you're saying. You want to use only important references that are necessary for understanding your article and where it fits in ongoing discussions. It's usually best to focus on analytical categories and not descriptions of earlier research. So if you've written for your dissertation a long literature survey in which each previous article or book gets at least one paragraph and maybe 3 or 4 or more, you don't want to do that. You want to summarize it very precisely, and it works usually most effectively if it's analytical categories rather than just A said this, B said that, C said that. And finally, remember that this is not the place to show off how much you have read. If your article has been accepted for publication, the readers, the editors agree that you know what you're talking about, and you don't need to show off. You need to just put in the minimal amount you need to get on with your discussion. So I hope you will all, when you write your literature reviews section, and don't even think of it as a section, think of it as part of your introduction. Keep some of these rules in mind, and good luck. Thank you.